The infrastructure projects at dilapidated Limpopo schools is back in focus. Section 27 is taking government to court to resume the projects aimed at fixing the province's dilapidated schools. The projects were halted in 2020 due to coronavirus budget cuts. The Public Interest Law Clinic represents 4 schools where the conditions are deplorable. Now, for more on the court challenge, I'm joined by Julia Chaskelson, who is the Research and Advocacy Officer at Section 27. Julia, very good afternoon. Talk to us about this impending court challenge.
Good afternoon, Hugo, and good afternoon to the viewers at home. Section 27 has been working with a number of schools in Limpopo for a long time, and what we've seen is that all of these schools have had serious infrastructure challenges, in some cases for decades. There are unsafe classrooms, there are classrooms without a roof, roofs have been blown off because of storms, issues with electricity, issues with overcrowding. And with all of these schools, they have tried engaging with the Limpopo Department of Education, sometimes escalating it all the way up to the National Department of Basic Education. They've tried engaging, they've tried writing letters, they've had meetings, and in many cases, these schools were promised infrastructure projects. Sometimes these projects were planned and budgeted for, but in 2020, because of the COVID-19 budget cuts, these projects effectively disappeared into thin air. Now, sort of 2 years later, these projects haven't resumed, but the conditions at the school remain very unsafe and not conducive for effective learning and teaching. So Section 27 has approached the High Court in Pretoria, and we're asking the court to set aside the decision to suspend those infrastructure projects in 2020 and to force the Limpopo Department to develop a plan to repair, upgrade and renovate these schools so that they don't have to wait decades more for the infrastructure that they desperately need.
Now, Julia, you talked about the schools and what they've attempted to do in speaking to the various authorities, the Department of Education, right all the way to the top. Have you made a similar engagement to Section 27?
Absolutely. Section 27 has been working with these schools to try and engage with the education authorities at various levels, and the feedback from school communities is that courts are kind of the last option and the only option available to them. When all other avenues of engagement have been tried and have not actually yielded results, where we're seeing years and years of learners going through schools without seeing any improvement to the infrastructure in which they learn, these schools have come to us, very active school communities, and have asked for our assistance to take the matter higher to court so that the education authorities are actually compelled to take steps to fix these infrastructure problems so that learners are not put at risk and so that their rights are not violated on a daily basis, but also so that education can continue. At all of these schools, for example, when there is a storm, learners are sent home because the noise on the roof or the shaking of the classrooms is so disruptive to learning that teachers cannot teach. We've got other classrooms where, because a roof has been blown off in a storm which happened 10 years ago, learners are crowded into classrooms and forced to share space, and they actually cannot concentrate because of the overcrowding. And there are very active school communities.
Allow me to come in there. I suppose the one thing that we also need to put into focus is the impact that all of this has on the learners, not just right now, but long term. Talk to us. I mean, you might not be an expert in that area, but I'd like to imagine those are some of the conversations that you would have had, and certainly some of the arguments that you would have put across in your papers to the courts.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hugo. I mean, the impact on learners is tangible at each of these schools. We've had learners saying that they cannot concentrate because the classrooms are so overcrowded, and of course in Limpopo the temperatures rise very high, and in overcrowded conditions the heat becomes fairly unbearable in classrooms. So this is not a conducive environment for learning. But in addition to the issues with overcrowding, learners have described how anxious they are about going to school. Where, for example, at Nzalama Primary School, where there is no roof over one block of classrooms, there's exposed electrical wiring, there are beams hanging from the ceiling, and learners have expressed fear about going to school and about how one more storm could really ruin the school and the structure could crumble. And how this environment is what characterizes their ability to learn, is that they associate schooling with fear and anxiety as opposed to it being a safe and nurturing environment. And you spoke to the long-term effects, and something that has been a challenge for some of our schools. For example, Chameti Secondary School in Limpopo it's a high school, and enrollment numbers have been going down. School is getting smaller and smaller because parents don't want their kids to go there. This is a school where there are cracks in the walls, the structure is unstable, there are mud brick classrooms which are incredibly hot and difficult to ventilate. And what we're seeing is that the performance of learners at those schools is lower than similar schools with better infrastructure in the same area. So the effects on teaching and learning cannot be understated when infrastructure is so poor. And this is something that really for many schools, it's been going on for decades. In Zalama, the roof was ripped off in 2012. At Dingamanzi Primary School, they first communicated the inadequate number of classrooms in 2001. So this means that entire generations of going through school, spending their entire school careers in overcrowded or unsafe conditions, and they're not seeing any improvements to the infrastructure in which they learn.
Well, what sort of government is this that has to be persuaded to look after learners, to look after its own citizens? When you speak of wires, bare wires, that could have potentially catastrophic effects on some of those learners.
It's a great question, Hugo. And what we saw is that with the COVID-19 pandemic, responses to the pandemic were fairly swift, as were responses in the education sector. Mobile toilets were provided to schools who did not have safe sanitation within a couple months of the pandemic being declared an emergency in South Africa. Whereas we know that the infrastructure challenges, including sanitation, including the lack of safe or adequate numbers of classrooms, have been going on for decades and decades of years now. So what we're saying at Section 27 is that kind of children in rural areas in Limpopo deserve better. They have rights to basic education, equality, dignity, a safe environment, and that government is ultimately failing to fulfill and uphold these rights. So that's part of what we're asking for in this court case, is for the court to declare the education authorities in breach of their constitutional obligations to these learners, and then also to develop a plan that not only protects their rights but enables them to learn.
Well, you've talked about certain amounts of money being budgeted for infrastructure development. You've also talked about certain amounts of money actually being set aside in order to repair or fix up the schools. What's happening to that money if it's set aside and not used in fixing the schools?
Well, this is part of the kind of the difficulty that we're facing with our schools, is that many of these schools, the school governing bodies, were provided with plans and budgets, but they have not seen money being spent at their schools. They have not seen contractors come and assess the site. They have not seen ground being broken. But according to the kind of estimates of provincial expenditure, money has been spent on these projects. So that's something that we're asking the court to investigate and for the department to clarify. But a big problem here is that kind of the education budget is shrinking in real terms year on year. And when you look at what is being spent per learner on infrastructure issues, in addition to kind of a number of other kind of supporting features that enable learners to learn, per learner funding is going down per year. So what we're asking the court to do is to ensure that in the government's plan, when they come up with a plan to address these infrastructure challenges at our 4 schools, but also at the schools across the province who have been affected by this decision to cut the budget, that they must identify the budgetary shortfalls and come up with plans to make ends meet. Ultimately, infrastructure is something that must be immediately realized according to government. And so they can't say that they don't have money for it now, they'll have money for it in future. They have to budget and plan carefully for this, and that's precisely why we're going to court, is to get them to meet those obligations.
Julia, final question, and really is to clarify an issue. You've said that money has been set aside. Are you therefore suggesting that some of that money has been misappropriated, which is potentially why there's been no reaction from the various departments of the Department of Education that you've gone to see to get some work done on these schools?
So perhaps I should clarify, Hugo. When these schools received budgets or plans for their projects prior to 2020, but because of the kind of the budget cuts in 2020, the Education Infrastructure Grant, which is the kind of large pool of money that funds infrastructure projects at schools around the country, that was largely kind of suspended. There was 6.6 billion rand that was moved around within that grant. Some of it was cut completely. Some of it was reprioritized to fund the COVID-19 response. So while we're not sure whether there's been financial mismanagement or something irregular going on, what we're saying is that the suspension of that money and the decision to suspend these projects, that was unconstitutional, and that decision must be reversed by the court.
Okay.
So we're hoping for clearer information from the education departments through our engagements with the court, which might be able to clarify some of the budgetary issues. But ultimately, this is something that is a repeated problem with the Limpopo Department of Education and a number of other provincial education departments, is that funding for school infrastructure, there's often underspending, there's often mismanagement of spending, and we need better plans so that learners don't have to wait for decades to get the infrastructure that they so desperately need.
Julia Jaskelson, Research and Advocacy Officer at Section 27. Thank you so much for speaking to us.